It begins with an adoption no one in town would talk about. On the surface, it seemed like a blessing. A childless couple, Samuel and Ruth Henderson, finally given the chance to start a family. But if you ask the older residents now, they'll lower their voices, glance toward the old Henderson farm, and tell you it was the start of something they wished had stayed buried. Hi everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Hit subscribe and tap the bell icon before this story pulls you in too deep. The file that tells this story sat untouched in a dusty courthouse basement for decades, sealed from public view. Its pages are brittle, typed on paper that smells faintly of mildew and damp earth. The first report dates back to 1932, when the Hendersons traveled to an orphanage 2 counties over. They were told the boy was special, quiet, reserved, and oddly detached from the other children. The matron described him as observant, though her choice of words in the intake notes is far more unsettling. He watches in ways that make the skin crawl. He was small for his age, pale, with dark, unblinking eyes that never seemed to reflect light. His papers had no birth record, no family history, only a date when he was found near the banks of Hollow Creek. When Samuel and Ruth brought him home, the town greeted them warmly at first. The boy, however, didn't speak for nearly 6 weeks. When he finally did, it was to ask Ruth a single question. "Do you have a place for me to wait?" At first, they chalked it up to shyness. But soon, animals began to avoid the Henderson property. Dogs would pull against their leashes, whining in the direction of the farmhouse. Birdsong seemed to vanish from the air. Even the livestock acted strange, refusing to graze near the boy when he wandered the pasture. The Hendersons loved him, or tried to, but the changes in their home were undeniable. Neighbors whispered that the couple's once bright kitchen windows now seemed to absorb sunlight rather than let it in. And in the photographs from that time, the boy never smiled. Not once. Just stood there, rigid, as though the camera had caught him in the middle of something he didn't want you to see. By the winter of 1933, the boy had grown more comfortable in the Henderson home, but comfortable is not the same as normal. Ruth wrote in her diary, later recovered from the attic, that she often found him awake at night, standing perfectly still in the dark hallway, eyes open, unblinking, facing the wall. Sometimes he would whisper to himself in a language she didn't recognize, low, throaty syllables that scraped against the air like dry leaves dragged over stone. Samuel began to notice strange markings appearing on the wood of the barn. At first he thought it was the work of vandals, scratches, etched deep into the beams, almost like claw marks. But the patterns were deliberate, spirals and intersecting lines, symmetrical but wrong, as if they were designed to be read by something that wasn't human. When he asked the boy about them, the child simply said, "It makes the waiting easier." The Hendersons didn't share these details with the town. Instead, they smiled through Sunday service, pretended the boy was adjusting well, and tried to convince themselves it was all just quirks. But the isolation was growing. Friends stopped visiting. Neighbors crossed the street when they saw Samuel or Ruth coming down the road. And then, there were the dreams. Both Samuel and Ruth began to dream of the same place, an endless field beneath a sky with no sun, no moon, just a gray, shifting light. In the center of that field stood the boy, wearing the same clothes he'd been found in, his face too pale, his eyes like pits. In the dream, he would raise one hand and point toward something in the distance, something neither Samuel nor Ruth could ever reach before waking. By spring, Ruth noticed the boy's reflection didn't always match his movements. If she looked quickly into a mirror, she swore she'd see him tilt his head a moment too late, or blink after she did. She began to avoid mirrors entirely. The breaking point came one evening when Samuel walked past the boy's room and saw him seated at the center of a perfect circle of small bones. They were arranged in patterns identical to the scratches in the barn. The boy looked up and smiled for the first time. It was not a human smile. Summer arrived with a heat that seemed to weigh on the house itself, pressing against its walls like a living thing. By now, The Hendersons spoke little to each other about the boy. Not because they had nothing to say, but because speaking it aloud made it too real. Ruth busied herself with chores she never used to care about, scrubbing the same dishes twice, hanging laundry that didn't need drying. Samuel spent more time in the barn, though lately even the animals seemed to shy away from him, eyes wide, as though they'd been spooked by something only they could sense. The boy wandered freely now. Some nights, neighbors spotted him standing at the edge of their property lines, staring toward their homes for hours without moving. When approached, he would simply turn and walk back toward the Henderson house, vanishing inside without a word. These encounters spread through the town like a sickness, whispered in the corners of the church, muttered behind hands in the general store. Then came the incident with the well. One scorching afternoon, Samuel found the boy at the old stone well on the far end of the property, peering down into its depths. The rope and bucket were gone, removed completely, and yet Samuel swore he heard something moving far below, like the slow drag of claws against stone. The boy didn't turn when Samuel called his name. Instead, in a voice colder than the water that once filled it, he said, "It's almost time." Ruth's health began to decline. She claimed she felt pulled in her sleep, as if someone, or something, was trying to drag her out of bed. When Samuel checked on her one morning, he found thin bruises around her wrists, shaped like fingers far too long to be his own. That same week, the Hendersons' only surviving photograph of their wedding day went missing from the mantel. 2 days later, Ruth found it in the boy's room. It had been cut lay down the middle, Samuel on one side, Ruth on the other, and between them, in the empty space where no one had stood, someone had drawn a figure in black ink. It was tall, its face hidden, its hands touching both Samuel and Ruth. By August, Samuel no longer referred to him as the boy. In private, he called him the thing that lives here. The summer broke with a sudden storm, rain that fell in sheets, thunder rolling low like something growling deep beneath the earth. The Hendersons had always welcomed storms. They were part of farm life, a reminder of nature's balance. But this one felt wrong. The air inside the house became heavy and damp. The light dimmed to a strange sepia shade, and the boy, he seemed almost excited. That night, Ruth woke to the sound of knocking. Not at the door, but inside the walls. The noise was slow, deliberate, traveling from room to room, as if something was moving within the house's bones. When she shook Samuel awake, the knocking stopped, replaced by the faint sound of breathing, impossibly close. The next morning, the cellar door stood wide open. They hadn't used the cellar in months, not since the floor had begun to sag and the air below had turned foul with rot. Yet muddy footprints, bare, narrow, and wet, led down into the darkness. Samuel called for the boy, but he didn't answer. It wasn't until later, while tending to the livestock, that Samuel saw him again. He was sitting on the fence, soaked through, mud clinging to his legs all the way to the knees, staring toward the house with an expression Samuel could only describe as expectant. The days that followed brought more changes. Neighbors stopped visiting entirely. One woman left a basket of bread and eggs at the Hendersons' gate, but wouldn't cross onto the property. She said she'd seen the boy's face in her dreams, twisted into shapes no human jaw could manage. Samuel began to keep a journal, pages of frantic scrawl detailing small events that didn't seem small at all. The milk turning sour hours after milking. Dead birds left in a perfect circle on the porch. The wind carrying whispers that repeated only one phrase, "It's almost time." Then came the night Ruth vanished. The bed was still warm when Samuel woke. Her pillow indented as though she'd risen only minutes earlier. But the house was silent. He searched every room, the barn, even the fields under the thin moonlight. He found her at the old well, standing on the stone rim. The boy was beside her, holding her hand, both staring down into the black water that no longer existed, When Samuel called out, they turned their heads in perfect unison and smiled. The well had been sealed for decades. When Samuel's grandfather owned the land, he'd built a small wooden shed over it, nailed shut, and told the family never to go inside. Samuel always thought it was just to keep children from falling in, but now, standing before the rotted boards with the boy at his side, he began to wonder what else the old man had been hiding. The shed door creaked open with almost no effort, as though it had been waiting for someone to return. Inside, the air was heavy, dense with the smell of wet stone and something far worse, something metallic, like rust and blood mixed together. The boy didn't hesitate. He stepped toward the center, placed his hand on the wooden lid covering the well, and whispered something in a language Samuel had never heard. The lid shifted, not upward but downward, as though the darkness below had pulled it in. The sound it made was like breathing. And then Samuel felt it too, the faint, deliberate pull of air from the hole, as if something deep below was exhaling after a long sleep. Ruth had followed them, barefoot, her hair wild, her eyes fixed on the boy. She didn't speak, but her lips moved silently in rhythm with whatever he was whispering. Her skin looked different in the dim light, almost translucent, and Samuel thought he could see the faint trace of veins moving, shifting, beneath it. Then came the noise. Not an echo, not the wind. It was the sound of many voices speaking at once from the bottom of the well, layered, distorted, as if hundreds of people were all whispering the same thing in unison. The boy leaned forward, listening, and his mouth slowly curled into a grin that had no warmth. When Samuel tried to step back, his feet refused to move. The ground felt soft, pliable, as though it was swallowing him inch by inch. He looked at Ruth for help, but her gaze was locked on him now, her smile matching the boy's. The voices from the well grew louder. They were calling his name. That night, Samuel did not sleep. He sat in his chair in the corner of the living room, shotgun across his lap, eyes fixed on the hallway leading to the boys' room. The air in the house had changed. It was thicker, heavier, and every so often, it carried a faint dampness, like the breath of a cellar that had been shut for a century. The boy had been silent since returning from the well. Ruth, on the other hand, moved through the house with a strange fluidity, almost drifting instead of walking. She hummed tunelessly, a low vibration that rattled Samuel's bones. When he asked her what she was humming, she looked at him with a flat, cold expression and said, "You'll remember soon enough." At 3:15 a.m., the humming stopped. The boy's bedroom door creaked open on its own. From the darkness, 2 pale feet stepped into the hall, bare, with toenails far too long, curling at the ends. The boy's head followed, tilting slightly, his eyes reflecting a dull, watery light, though there was no source for it. He spoke, but his mouth didn't move. The words were inside Samuel's head, too loud to be thoughts, too close to be coming from anyone else. "You've been here before." Samuel's vision blurred. Images, faded, black and white, flashed in his mind. A younger version of himself as a boy, standing beside this very house, but with people who were not his parents. Faces stretched unnaturally long, jaws slightly unhinged, eyes that blinked sideways like fish. They surrounded him, holding his shoulders, pushing him toward the well. He gasped, and the vision broke. The boy was now standing inches from him, looking up, that grin still there but stretched unnaturally wide. Ruth stood in the hallway behind him, her head tilted at an angle no human neck should manage, her eyes glazed with a milky film. Samuel gripped the shotgun tighter, but when he tried to move, the weight of the air itself seemed to press him down. The boy leaned closer and whispered in a voice that was not his own. "It's time to go back." Samuel never remembered standing up. One moment, the boy was whispering into his ear, and the next, he was walking, barefoot, though he didn't remember removing his boots, Down the hallway, past the kitchen, past the pantry, and out into the cold night. The ground was wet, though it hadn't rained. The grass felt spongy beneath his feet, like walking on something that was breathing. The boy was already there, standing at the well. Ruth followed silently behind Samuel, her hands clasped in front of her like a grieving widow at a funeral. The old stone well loomed like a mouth in the earth, blacker than the night around it, its wooden frame sagging with rot. Samuel's breath frosted in the air, though he could not feel the cold anymore. The boy tilted his head and spoke again, not aloud, but inside Samuel's skull, where the words could not be ignored. They called me home. You were supposed to come back sooner. Samuel's chest tightened. Memories that had no place in his life rose to the surface. Being lowered into this well as a child, water swallowing the light above him, hands reaching from below to pull him into the dark. He remembered screaming, but the sound had been muffled by the water, and something warm had touched his cheek as he sank. Ruth stepped closer, her voice finally breaking the silence. It's the only way, Sam. It's always been the only way. The boy smiled and held out his hand. It was small, delicate, and webbed between the fingers. The skin was cold and slick like the belly of a fish pulled from deep water. Samuel's hands shook as he took it. The boy's grip was far stronger than it should have been. With one sudden pull, Samuel was drawn to the edge of the well. He looked down, expecting blackness, but there was light, faint and greenish, swirling far below. Shapes moved in it, too many to count. Their pale faces turned upward, mouths opening in perfect silence. The last thing Samuel felt was the cold pull from below, wrapping around him like the embrace of a long-lost family. When morning came, the house was empty. The well water was still, save for the ripples that spread outward, as if something had just gone under.